Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, very excited about today's show. I know I say that all the time. I say that every week, but I pretty much always am. I'm not, not blowing sunshine. I'm telling you the truth. I'm always excited about today's show because I almost always have something very new to share with you. And even if it's not absolutely new, it's a new perspective on something that we already knew that sheds new light on stuff. And it's really, really cool. And I got plenty of that today, plenty of it today. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to be continuing in our series discussing what I call the Roman Chronicle, which in other words is how the Roman Empire affects our understanding of the nativity story. And then the really cool thing is that if we apply these lessons appropriately to this particular story in the Bible, that means we can apply it to any story in the Bible as well, because everything I'm talking about has very significant influence, not only on the nativity story, but especially on the New Testament. And we're just going to dive right in and we're going to talk about that. Sorry about this over here. This bright thing here is sunlight coming through a window that, that'll go away in just a couple of minutes as the sun moves. But not much I can do about it right at this particular second, because it's a window it's actually a window in my door, one of those upper windows in my door. And there's no way to block it out without running over there and, putting a piece of cardboard over it or something like that. But anyway, let's talk about this. Let's jump right in. So we have been spending quite a bit of time talking about, like I said, the Roman Empire, the Roman Chronicle, and how understanding the Roman Empire will actually help us understand the nativity story. See, because as you've heard me say, my goal has always been, the goal of God Save the King is very simply to tell the nativity story as biblically, historically, archaeologically, and astronomically accurate as possible. Well, why? Okay. Well, I want to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. It's just that simple. That is the ultimate goal, is to be a faithful follower of Jesus. Well, in order to be a faithful follower of Jesus, I also have to be a faithful interpreter of scriptures. And as we have talked about many, many, many times, one of the most significant components in understanding scripture is context. Context. And as we have talked about many times, there's actually more than one kind of context. There's grammatical context, there's literary context, there's historical context, and then there's cultural context. And we are spending our time talking mostly about historical and cultural context at the moment. We shift back and forth. There's times when I'll mention the other contexts as well, but the one we're working with for the moment is historical and cultural context. And that's because, as I mentioned previously in other segments, if you simply look at the Bible writers themselves, and I mentioned in particular Luke and Paul, because both of them are very interesting individuals, because they were both ethnic Jews. I know that historically we have tried to say that Luke was a Gentile. I don't believe that's accurate. I believe he was a Hellenized Jew. So in other words, he was an ethnic Jew, but he grew up in a city that was culturally Greek. See, so that's why he comes off as potentially acting a lot like a Gentile, is because he is so inundated with Greek policies and procedures, with Greek culture, right, that he comes off that way. And we know that he was most likely a physician, that he used medical terminology, and he had a very, very strong Greek vocabulary. He had a huge vocabulary, so he's an educated man. But he was likely, and then Paul, we know, of course, was absolutely ethnically Jewish. He had a tremendous education as well. He probably grew up speaking Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek, probably all three, right? Luke probably grew up speaking Greek and maybe Aramaic, right? Probably would have picked that up along the way, so to speak. But they were both born here, ready? They were both born in Roman provinces. Oh, interesting. Very interesting. They were both born in what today we would call modern Turkey. Southeastern modern Turkey is where both of them were, or actually, Paul was from Tarsus, which would have been in modern Turkey. I take that back. Luke technically was probably from Antioch, which would have been in Syria back then, the Roman province of Syria, and it's still Syria, still called Syria today, right? So a little bit of correction there. But nonetheless, these were both Roman provinces. So here you go. And we talked about the fact that Paul argued from the point of view on occasion of being a Roman citizen. Very interesting, right? Luke was probably not a Roman citizen, but he was a Roman provincial. So he was raised most likely in a Roman provincial capital. Therefore, both of these men would have understood Judaism, Second Temple Judaism. They would have understood Hellenic culture because they were from Greek-speaking parts of Asia Minor and Syria, and then they were raised inside the Roman Empire. So they would have understood all of this to a certain degree. It doesn't mean they would have understood everything about everything, but they would have understood a lot of this. And then likewise, when you look at their travels and where they went, and you look at the language being used. I mean, I'm going to break out a map here at some point, and we're going to look at the names of the Roman provinces. Well, the names of these Roman provinces, you're going to recognize all of them because they're right in the Bible. Paul and Luke used the Roman provincial names of the locations they were traveling to. Why? Because they lived in the Roman Empire. What else were you going to use? Right? Now, you might use the Hebrew for it or the Aramaic, but why would you do that when the Roman Empire was the dominant culture of the time? And therefore, that would have been the most useful to communicate to the most people as quickly and easily as possible. That even though they were explaining Jewish cultural things, they were doing it to primarily a Greek-speaking audience living in the Roman Empire. Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Now, also in other episodes, I go over the background extensively, sometimes going back as far as eternity past, talking about the everlasting covenant, and then moving forward, talking about the Abrahamic covenant, the land, the seed, and the blessing, the fact that God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham and promised him a specific geophysical area, geography, promised to Abraham and his descendants. And then as you move forward through the Old Testament, you'll watch Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whether they are in or out of the land. And then you get Joseph, who has to leave the land in order to save the Jewish people. And then Moses has to leave Egypt and take them back to the land to save the Jewish people. And then you got Joshua and the conquest, and then you have Judges. And then you get to the period of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. Israel is at its most extensive geographically, economically, politically, and militarily, and frankly, probably ideologically at the same time. They probably had a pretty good influence in the region ideologically at the same time, right? And then, of course, once Solomon dies, then you get the kingdom gets divided because of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And you get the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and then you get the captivities. The Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom, then 100 years later, and that's because they go apostate much faster than the southern kingdom. And then about 100 years later, the southern kingdom gets conquered by Babylon, who also conquers the Assyrians. And then, of course, the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and then the Greeks conquer the Persians, and then the Romans conquer the Greeks. Okay, so this is actually very important historical background because it does all of it. It definitely influences the cultural background of the region at that time. It's very, very significant. So here's an example. I want you to take note of this. The first empire to conquer Israel was Assyria. Then the second one to conquer Israel was Babylon. And then the third one to conquer Israel was Persia. Okay? Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Now, those are all what we would call Eastern empires. In other words, they are east of the Euphrates River, but they're east of the break, what is considered to be the break between Europe and Asia, according to ancient sources. The ancient sources, primarily the Greeks and the Romans, considered the break between Europe and Asia to be the Bosporus, or the opening between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where Constantinople is today, or Istanbul today, Constantinople in the Middle Ages. And that's considered the break. Well, if it's not there, then it's certainly the northern leg of the Euphrates River is definitely the distinction between East and West. And this is where we get the phrase the Near East. See, today we don't use this phrase very much. We tend to call it the Middle East and not the Near East. But the Middle East and the Near East are not exactly the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. The Middle East in our modern context would be Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq. That would be considered the Middle East. But the Near East is a classical term that meant everything just east of Greece and Rome. Hence the demarcation line being the Bosporus, okay? The entrance to the Black Sea, that would be the distinction that marked East and West, okay? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because take note that, trying to stay out of the sunlight here, sorry guys, it makes me look funny on camera. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians were all Eastern empires, okay? Well, the Greeks and the Romans were not Eastern empires, and neither of them were initially empires. This is interesting because, boy, could we rabbit trail on this, because this actually does get into the ideological background of the ancient world, and therefore the ideological background of the Bible and how we understand it in this, there you go, context, okay? Because the Greeks invented democracy, so to speak, right? They invented democracy, and yet they became an empire. And one of the lessons that the Greeks taught us was you can't have a democracy and an empire at the same time, or at least not for very long, okay? Then the Romans, well, they invented republicanism, okay? So, and then they became an empire. And the lesson that they taught us is you can't have a republic and an empire at the same time, or at least not for very long. So there's definitely a lesson there, because we're a democratic republic, okay? The United States. I live in the United States. If you're watching this internationally, the United States is a democratic republic, and that's a very important lesson. You can't have a democratic republic and an empire at the same time, or at least not for very long. And it's very provocative then that in eschatology, you know, we talk about the revived Roman Empire. See, so it's no coincidence, it is no coincidence historically and culturally that you have empires, human worldly empires, are about to come into direct contact with the kingdom of God. Okay? That contrast is in your face, and it's supposed to be in your face. It's supposed to be. Now, take note of this. Like I said, you had 3 Eastern empires that all conquered Israel at one time or another, or conquered each other, which included Israel, right? Assyria, Babylon, and then Persia. But then Greece started out as a democracy. Rome started out as a republic, but they both became empires. Well, how did they become empires? They became empires by invading the East. Wow. Whoa. Wait a second. Time out. Did I just say that? Yeah, they became empires by invading the East. It was under Alexander the Great that he went to the East, okay, and invaded Mesopotamia, okay, the Near East, the Middle East, and he almost got to the Far East, started to get to the Far East. Interesting. So the Greeks became an empire by invading the East. And then the same thing when the Greeks diminished and the Romans came in from the West and going east, they started as a republic, and then they became an empire by invading the East. Wow. Very, very, very interesting. And once again, see, it is no coincidence that this is the macrocosm. Okay, this is the macro culture in which the Second Temple period exists. The Second Temple period started when the Persians let the Jews go from captivity, from Babylonian captivity, and allowed them to go home and rebuild the temple, right? And then the Greeks came in and conquered the Persians, which means they controlled Israel as well. And then, of course, see, they wanted to drive Hellenism. They wanted Hellenism to be a one world culture, one language, one religion, one culture, one political system, one economic system. See, that's what empire is. So it is no, wow, sorry the sunlight here, guys. It is no coincidence. I got to sit like right here, okay? So it's no coincidence that these human worldly empires are what is, is what's affecting us. God darn it. Sorry, guys. I'm really sorry about this. It's very hard for me to stare at myself on the camera when I've got the sun glaring right in my eyes like that. So really sorry about it. But anyway, continuing. Very, very interesting that these 3 Eastern empires conquered Israel, and then Greece and Rome became empires by invading the East. So what I want to talk about today, where we're headed, is talking about how Rome came to invade the East. What stimulated that? What caused that? What was the cause behind why Rome felt it necessary to invade the East? Because Rome started out as a monarchy. It started out as a kingdom. And initially it was very small around the city of Rome itself. And then eventually they conquered the Italian peninsula. And then they started to branch out further than that, started to go to the west and go to Gaul and Spain, and then they went to the east and they went through the Balkans and down into the Greek peninsula. But then eventually they crossed over into what we today call Asia Minor or Turkey. But that was, that was a designation that was actually started by the Greeks and then adopted by the Romans, was to call what we would call modern Turkey, to call that Asia. Okay. So what was it that caused this? What were the circumstances that made this happen? Because you remember, like we repeat all the time, Alexander's empire stretched all the way from the Greek peninsula to the Indus River, right? And then when he died, his kingdom fractured very, very, very quickly. Initially, it was 5 generals who divvied up his empire. One of those was defeated very quickly, so it became 4 generals that divvied up his empire. And then the 2 that are the most significant for our purposes were Seleucus and Ptolemy, because Seleucus got the east. He got Syria and Mesopotamia, and then Ptolemy got Egypt. And Israel lies right between the Ptolemaic territory and the Seleucid or Seleucid territory, and they actually fought over Israel quite a bit as to who would control it. Okay, so as you move forward in time, the Seleucid Empire starts to decline because it was so big. It was so big you could not control that much space in a Hellenistic fashion without importing a ton of natural-born Greeks into the area. You weren't going to be able to force people to become Hellenic. Now, Hellenism had great appeal, so there were a lot of people that adopted Hellenism. I mean, you had you go all the way to Central Asia, and you've got some very, very interesting Greek influence in the cultures of Central Asia that lasted for centuries. Very, very provocative stuff that went on in what today would be Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and then down into Afghanistan and Pakistan and India even. I mean, I've mentioned this before. It's just a little bit of trivia that we sometimes forget and don't realize, that the modern city of Kandahar in Afghanistan, that's their pronunciation of Alexandria. That was a city founded by Alexander the Great and named after himself. Kandahar, Alexandria. You can kind of see the similarity there, but that is how far east the Greek influence went. And then depending on the exact region, right, because certain regions started to declare independence and break away and stuff like that. But in other areas, that Greek influence remained for a while, even a couple of centuries. So very, 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 very provocative, right? So at any rate, the Seleucid Empire, by the time you get to the middle of the 3rd century, so like roughly 250 BC, they're starting to disintegrate, okay? And then by the time you get, I shouldn't say that. That's too early to use the word disintegrate. They're starting, certain provinces and kingdoms are declaring independence, so small chunks are breaking away. That's the better way to say it in 250 BC is that small pieces are breaking away. But then by the time you fast forward to about 150 BC, middle of the 2nd century BC, now the Seleucid Empire is actually beginning to decline. And by the time you hit about the middle of the 1st century BC, the Seleucid Empire doesn't exist. So, 250 BC, some pieces are breaking off. 150 BC, it's actually starting to break apart. And then by 50 BC, it's gone. Okay, it's completely gone, right? And this is extremely interesting because the Romans, like I said, started as a kingdom, realized that they didn't like having a monarch because a monarch could become a tyrant, a single ruler. So they established this idea of 2 rulers ruling simultaneously. They were called consuls, and they were elected at the same time for a term of 1 year. So the whole idea was they would serve as a counterbalance to each other. So that was right around 500 BC is when they established that pattern. But by the time you get to about 100 BC, okay, with Rome advancing to the east, they're not in full empire mode yet, not by a long shot, but boy, are they ramping up. They're getting there, right? See, because by the time you get to about 100 BC, they had just rolled into Greece. There was almost no resistance to them not so much conquering, but occupying Greece. They just kind of rolled across the border and took Greece. Pretty simple, right? But the Seleucids still controlled Asia Minor at this time, right? And they still had some expansionist ideas. So there was actually a series of wars between Rome and the Seleucid rulers in Asia Minor. Most of the battles actually took place on the Greek peninsula because the rulership of Asia Minor was established by these Seleucid rulers, and therefore they were jumping across the Aegean and Ionian seas and attacking Greece in specifically, right? So this is all in and around the late 2nd century BC and the early 1st. Did I say that right? Yeah. So Rome occupied the Balkans and then the Greek peninsula by the late 3rd century BC. But then by about 200 BC, Rome was coming into contact. Yeah, I misstated. So let me restate because I'm doing a lot of this from memory. So I just slipped on the numbers there. Rome occupied the Balkans and the Greek peninsula in the late 3rd century BC with very little opposition. Very, very, very little opposition whatsoever. So then if you fast forward about 100 years, by the late... Okay, sorry guys. I'm sorry. That is the late 3rd century. The late 3rd century BC. See, this is the problem with dealing with these dates and it being in reverse, is it gets really easy to flip it in your head without realizing. The Romans occupied the Balkans and the Greek peninsula by the late 3rd century BC with little to no opposition, meaning you're looking at around 200 BC, roughly, okay? Now, but also by this time, that meant because they had occupied the Balkans and the Greek peninsula, now they were starting to have contact with the Seleucid Empire. So in 190 BC was when the Romans crushed, frankly, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III, who is also known as Antiochus the Great, at the Battle of Magnesia. It was a really crushing defeat, okay? And then in the subsequent treaty, after the defeat, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Apamea that was in 188 BC. Antiochus III surrendered all of Western Anatolia to the Romans. Now, take note, I used the word Anatolia. That is another classical term for modern Turkey, or what would be called Asia Minor. But these terms, it's really easy to get them mixed up with the same word, but being used, here you go, in a different context. Because like today, we don't think of Asia as Turkey, right? You have to be thinking in a classical context. And I have to say Asia Minor. Well, another name for that is Anatolia. And that will help me keep this straight by calling it Anatolia, okay? So the Romans defeat the Seleucid king Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia, and he surrenders pretty much the western half of Anatolia to the Romans. And then what the Romans did is they installed a vassal king to rule western Anatolia from Pergamum, okay? So when this king died, as King Attalus III, when King Attalus III died in 133, because he had been an ally of Rome, he bequeathed his entire kingdom to Rome. So he was a Roman client kingdom, right? So he understood that he was under Roman dominion. It was an independent kingdom, but it was under Roman dominion. Get it? Okay. So he ran that kingdom for the Romans. And then because he was a Roman ally, when he died, he said, hey, it's yours. You can just keep it, right? You can just keep it. And that's because partially because he didn't have an heir. So it became pretty simple to do that. Now, the irony is, or it's not really that ironic, I should say, it's probably a better word to use, is that as a result of this, as the result of bequeathing that kingdom to Rome, a bunch of rebellions broke out all through Anatolia or Asia Minor. A whole bunch of rebellions broke up. Okay. So for the next, 30 years, you got a little of this, little of that, little of this, little of that. And then once you cross the line into the early 1st century BC, now things start to really ramp up. Okay. Things start to really change and ramp up because there is a king of the kingdom of Pontus. Now, Pontus is the northern coastline of what would be Turkey or Asia Minor or Anatolia. Pontus was the northernmost region on the coastline there. The king of Pontus, his name was Mithridates. Now, there's another Mithridates in our story coming up later, so I will do my best to keep them separate, because that's a problem with this information, is that you got a lot of names that are repeated, and it makes it very difficult to keep them all straight when they've got the same name, when one of them are kings of different countries and empires, right? Oh my God. So, there it is, right? But Mithridates is the king of Pontus, okay? And he is the one that gets a whole bunch of allies out of Asia Minor to fight against the Romans. He really stirs them up against the Romans and against Roman encroachment into Anatolia, right? So what you have is a series of wars that they're referred to as the Mithridatic Wars. And they were these wars between Rome and Mithridates of Pontus, okay? There were 3 separate periods. So some historians refer to it as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Mithridatic Wars. Not unreasonable. But from Rome's point of view, it was one war, because what happened is that by about 88 BC, Mithridates and his allies had conquered pretty much all of Asia Minor back from the Romans, okay? And Mithridates instigated not only a mass revolt, but a mass slaughter of any Roman citizen, provincial, Italian, anything in the province of Asia, in the Roman province of Asia, right? Contemporary estimates range anywhere from about 80 to 150,000 just slaughtered outright, right? We're not talking battle casualties. We're talking wade into the city or the village or the region or whatever, and then just if they're Roman or if they're Italian, kill them. That's it, right? Also, something Mithridates did is that he encouraged piracy on a large scale. So these two things were interrelated. On one hand, you had direct military conflict, and then on the other hand, he encouraged piracy, right? So these pirates, quote unquote, they kind of had official sanction, but then no, they didn't have official sanction, and they could have been from any of the seafaring provinces all through Asia Minor, and what they did is they raided all through the Eastern Mediterranean, all through the Greek islands, sometimes even as far as Italy, okay? And it was straight up piracy. We know what piracy is. Piracy means, a criminal act, okay, but conducted, by boat or ship, right? And you either attack another boat or another ship, or you attack a port city, right? And you kidnap, you take hostages, you sell them as slaves, you steal goods, right? It's piracy, piracy. So Mithridates not only attacked the Romans openly with direct warfare, he also encouraged piracy on a large scale. So the Romans, of course, they declared war. The Senate declared war. Okay, so like I said, because there are three convenient periods of time, sometimes if you click on Wikipedia, it's going to talk about three Mithridatic wars, right? Also in Wikipedia, it will mention the fact that from the Roman point of view, the Senate declared war once, and then it wasn't until it was completely done that the Roman Senate said, okay, the singular Mithridatic war is actually over. Okay. But the reason this is relevant, the reason all this is relevant is because the Roman commanders that were given command of the Roman army to go after Mithridates, and then especially to go after Mithridates and the pirates, were given extraordinary latitude in their power. So these individuals had tremendous power, tremendous individual power. Because when you say the word emperor, okay, usually the first two people that come to mind are Julius and Augustus Caesar. And for good reason, because Julius Caesar was a de facto emperor. He wasn't technically called that. The first Roman emperor of the Roman Empire was Augustus, but Julius Caesar sure acted like one. So it's not an unfair characterization. It was just not the official title, right? So to speak, okay? Because the English word emperor is actually a derivation of the Latin word imperator, which simply means commander, but it meant chief commander, it meant supreme commander. And it was usually something that the troops would bestow upon their commander. Their commander might be a general, okay? But then the troops might say, well, no, you're not just general, you are imperator, you are supreme commander, right? So when the term imperator got thrown into the mix, that started to change things, because like I said, that's eventually where we get the word emperor, right? So like I said, when you say emperor, usually the first two people you think of are Julius and Augustus Caesar. Well, the Roman generals that fought Mithridates and then fought the pirates, they were given tremendous latitude, tremendous individual power, and several of them were called imperator by their troops. See, there you go. So my point being is that you've got the machinations or mechanics of empire building in the Roman takeover of Anatolia, of Asia Minor, right? So very quickly, just to throw some names out here so you can get the idea, the Mithridatic Wars lasted from between 88 BC and 63 BC. Three different periods. So three different wars from one point of view, one long war from the Roman point of view. So the major Roman leaders, there were more than these, several more than these, but the major Roman leaders were Sulla, okay, Sulla, Murena, Murena, Lucullus or Lucullus, Lucullus, and then Pompey Magnus, okay? So Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Lucius Licinius Murena, Lucius, this is rough, Licinius Lucullus, right? And then Gnaeus Pompey Magnus were the four major generals that conducted the Mithridatic Wars. The first Mithridatic War was primarily Sulla, right? The second Mithridatic War was Sulla and then Murena. And then the third Mithridatic War was Lucullus and then Pompey. Okay. Now, throughout these three wars, one war, right, the Romans were primarily victorious. Overall, they won, and they won consistently. But there were a few setbacks, and there were especially a few moments when the Romans had Mithridates surrounded, and he would happen to escape. So therefore, they didn't, finally defeat him and crush him. He lived to fight another day. Plus, there was a treaty or two that got thrown into the mix. So that's why it took 3 different major seasons of warfare to finally defeat Mithridates, plus the pirates, right? Because when you get to the Third Mithridatic War, I mentioned the fact that this was Lucullus, right, or Lucullus. He was actually the first supreme commander against Mithridates during the Third Mithridatic War, okay? But while he was fighting Mithridates directly, Pompey got called out of retirement to go after the pirates, okay? And Pompey was given 3 years to mop up the piracy in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it took him like 3 months or less, actually way less. He wiped them out in record time. Okay. Now, I should mention this when we talk about the piracy very quickly. It was piracy. Make no mistake. It was piracy. Shipboard criminal activity against other ships or against port cities to take booty. Okay. Goods, right. Commodities, right. And then also people, kidnapping, slavery, things like that. But what that did is it really disrupted trade. That's the problem, is because if you were a merchant who relied on your either exporting your goods via ship or importing goods via ship, you got a problem if there's piracy throughout the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So this was a really big deal that they called Pompey out of retirement, okay, to deal with the pirates. It was really a big deal. And then, although Lucullus had been very successful, he did happen to get called back to Rome at a very opportune time. So as a result, because Pompey had been so successful, the Romans just told Pompey to take over and become the new supreme commander of the Roman army in the east and to go after Mithridates. And he did. Okay, he went after Mithridates. So here's a summary of what happened. Pompey defeated Mithridates. Now, Mithridates was the king of Pontus. And remember, I said, I'll get out a map here in a second. Pontus was the northernmost region of Anatolia. Okay. Once Pompey defeated Mithridates, half of Pontus became a Roman province. Okay. And it was called, here you go, get out your Bible, get out the book of Acts, and listen to these names, right? The Roman province was called Bithynia and Pontus. Okay. Bithynia, right? Bithynia and Pontus. And then the other half of Pontus remained an independent kingdom, but it was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. So you had half of it became a province, half of it became a client kingdom. Okay. Now, in addition, Pompey also made moves to conquer Armenia. Now, this is not, it's in the same general area as modern Armenia, but ancient Armenia was much bigger. It was a much larger region, okay? It encompassed almost the eastern half of Asia Minor, okay? So Pompey moved to invade Armenia, but he also engaged in negotiations, and the Armenians under Tigranes II, if I remember correctly, just surrendered, right? And Armenia became a client kingdom. Now, this is very provocative because Tigranes II, king of Armenia, had been appointed king of Armenia by the Parthians. So all this time, all this focus on the Romans. The Parthians are the superpower to the east, and that is simmering over there. Okay, and that's going to come into play here very, very quickly, because what's going on is you've got the Seleucid Empire is declining, because you've got the Romans pushing from the west. You've got the Parthians pushing from the east, and the Seleucids, and you've got the Jews. The Jews declared their independence in the south, and although the Jews didn't chop off big chunks of territory like the Parthians and the Romans did, it's still a thorn in their side. So from three sides, from west, east, and south, you've got this Seleucid Empire is just diminishing like crazy. Okay. As a matter of fact, once the Seleucid Empire ceased to be, with the death of Antiochus the 13th, I think it was, with the death of Antiochus the 13th, and with Pompey having conquered all of Asia Minor and all of Syria, right? Because what happens is Pompey, he gets all of Asia Minor, he gets Pontus, he gets Asia Minor, he gets Galatia, he gets Cilicia, he gets Armenia, he gets Cappadocia, he gets Syria, he gets all of it. He gets all of it. It is the single largest territorial acquisition in the history of the Roman Empire. Ah, interesting. It is the single largest territorial acquisition in the history of the Roman Empire, and Pompey got it all, right? Once he had conquered that, and he had made Pontus, part of Pontus is a province, part of Pontus is now a client kingdom, Cilicia is now a province, Galatia is now a province. He makes Syria a province. Armenia is a client kingdom. Pompey did not even offer the Seleucids the opportunity to be a client kingdom. He just waved them off. You're done. The Seleucids are done. That's it. It's over. Syria is now a Roman province. Okay? So what's very, very, very interesting about this is that go all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant and the promise made to Abraham that the promised land given to the descendants of Abraham would be from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, right? Well, Egypt won't become a Roman province until 30 BC, but Egypt is already under Rome's thumb at this time, okay? They're not in 100% control, but Egypt is being dominated by Rome already at this point. So isn't it interesting that Pompey has now taken possession of the land from Egypt to the Euphrates basically without firing a shot and pretty much overnight, right? So, and Pompey set his sights, he immediately got involved in the dynastic squabble that was going on in Judea, because if you remember our other episodes talking about what's going on in Judea, under Judah Maccabee, you have the Maccabean revolt. He rules for several years, then one of his brothers, then another one of his brothers, and then one of his brothers' sons takes over. That's the demarcation between what are known as the Maccabees and what are known as the Hasmoneans, right? So all Maccabees are Hasmoneans. Not all Hasmoneans were Maccabees. But under the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, the Jews are chipping away at Seleucid power as well. But by the time you get to the middle of the 60s BC, 67 BC is when Salome Alexandra dies, and her oldest son, Hyrcanus, is supposedly going to take the throne, but he gets immediately attacked by his little brother, who takes the throne from him, and a civil war ensues. So at the same time, this is when Pompey is wrapping up the Third Mithridatic War and conquering all of Asia Minor, plus Pontus and Cappadocia and Syria and Armenia. So he immediately goes, yep, I will absolutely get involved in this dynastic struggle in Judea, because, very simple, the more of the Mediterranean, it's not just pure land acquisition. Okay, it's not just pure land acquisition. What this means is the more of the coastline you control, the better you control international trade. There it is. The more you control international trade. So now, why is all of this relevant? Okay, well, number one, it gives you the historical background so that you understand the activities of the characters involved. Because remember, so this is the context that the Hasmoneans are operating in, right? This is the context that the Hasmoneans are operating in. Okay, you've got the Romans, are coming in from the west. The Parthians are coming in from the east. The Seleucids are disintegrating right in front of them. Okay, so you got some really, really powerful players going on here. And if you are a very clear thinking individual, you can frankly predict what's coming. You can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. And one of these very clear thinking individuals was a man named Antipater, who was chief minister to Hyrcanus. Okay, so remember what I said a moment ago. When Queen Salome Alexandra died, her oldest son Hyrcanus, who is already operating as high priest, was supposed to become king. But his little brother Aristobulus attacked him militarily and took the throne from him. And this resulted in a civil war. Well, part of the reason that Hyrcanus didn't just go away was because his chief minister was this man Antipater. And Antipater was extraordinarily ambitious and extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily clear-minded, and he knew that it wasn't going to be very long that Rome was going to be in control of the whole area. And it didn't, and therefore it didn't really matter who is in charge. What mattered was who was a friend of Rome. That's what mattered. What mattered was who was a friend of Rome. But then also why this is very important is because none of this is a coincidence that one of the most powerful empires in the history of the world is going to be ruling Judea when God initiates the kingdom of heaven on earth in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? So you've got, on one hand, you've got one of the most powerful worldly empires ever. And yet, on the other hand, you've got the kingdom of God, which you know who's going to win, right? You know who's going to win. But God doesn't play by worldly rules. He doesn't play by worldly rules. And the reason this history lesson is important is because these Roman commanders in the Mithridatic Wars were given extraordinary power, right? See, Caesar overshadowed Pompey because Caesar had better marketing. It's an oversimplification, but not much, right? Because while Pompey was engaged in the east, Caesar was off in Gaul conquering Gaul. Okay, well, and it wasn't because Caesar was richer or prettier or more powerful. He had better marketing. He was writing letters back to Rome, and they were what's the word? Advertising, marketing. propaganda. There you go. They were propaganda, extolling how great he was, right? So that's why when you think emperor, you think Caesar, you don't think Pompey. But Pompey, he didn't add a single province to the Roman Empire. He added an entire empire to the Roman Empire. Okay? And this is no coincidence. And then I'll wrap up here. We're running out of time. So here is the summary statement. As Rome is doing this, they're missing something. And what they're missing is the Parthians. They are so focused on taking over this giant chunk of land and the wealth that it is going to bring them that they are missing the fact that this empire is not the superpower. The Seleucids have declined. You got a whole bunch of minor client kingdoms, but it's the Parthians that are the superpower to the east, and the Romans are missing it. It's not that they don't know that they're there. It's not that they're not talking to them. They are talking to them. We'll talk about that next time. They initially meet and they talk and stuff like that, but they are underestimating the Parthians. So what's going to happen over the next 100 years and more, but what's going to happen over the next 100 years is that the Romans are going to consistently miss it when it comes to the Parthians. And that's why the Parthians are going to have a very unique role in the nativity story. So this is the macrocosm of the context of what we're looking at is Rome taking this big chunk out of the east and then, missing what's going to happen when they come into direct contact with the Parthians. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've run out of time. I'm going to end it right there. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. I can't wait until next time because we're going to take up what we're talking about this. We'll see you then. God Save the King.